One man, an extraordinary financial wizard, lent the equivalent of $8 billion to forge America into existence. Yet he died penniless, his name largely forgotten, and ultimately betrayed by the very government he had saved. While iconic figures like Washington braved the frigid Delaware and Franklin charmed the courts of Paris, a Polish Jewish immigrant, toiling in a modest Philadelphia office, was meticulously signing checks that would singularly determine the nascent United States' survival. Haym Salomon channeled more funds into the Continental Congress than the entire gross domestic product of most European nations combined. His private loans sustained George Washington's struggling army, providing food, clothing, and weaponry during 3 perilous years when Britain held the undeniable advantage. But a profound truth remains largely untold. Salomon didn't merely fund the revolution. In many ways, he owned it. At one critical juncture, this refugee commanded 75% of the fledgling nation's staggering war debt. The American government found itself owing him personally more than its combined debt to France, Spain, and Holland. When Congress desperately needed cash for vital ammunition, they turned to him. When Washington required emergency funds to mobilize his troops, Haym delivered overnight. When the treasury lay utterly bare and defeat seemed an inescapable certainty, a single man's signature on a piece of paper miraculously kept the revolution alive. Yet, bafflingly, this financial prodigy, whose ability to multiply money seemed akin to magic, breathed his last in a New York slum. His family reduced to pleading for meager scraps from the very government he had salvaged. For 2 centuries, the United States Congress steadfastly refused to honor its debt to the Salomon family, citing lost or insufficient records, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that America owed them millions. How could the man who financed America's very birth be so utterly expunged from its historical narrative? How does someone who wielded more wealth than Benjamin Franklin, commanded more political influence than Alexander Hamilton, and possessed more far-reaching connections than Paul Revere, vanish so completely that the vast majority of Americans have never even heard his name? The untold story behind Haym Salomon's meteoric rise and tragic fall unearths the hidden financial machinery that truly powered the creation of the United States, alongside the dark and sobering truth about the fate of those who made it all possible. This isn't just a tale about one man's money. It's an expose of how America's founding fathers built their revolution on a shaky foundation of borrowed cash, broken promises, and the profound sacrifice of the very immigrants who, against all odds, saved them. This is the harrowing account of the billionaire nobody remembers, the undisputed king of American debt, and one of the gravest financial betrayals in our nation's history. But here's where the history books get messy. Was Salomon truly a billionaire lender, or was he something far more sophisticated, the ultimate Patriot broker? To uncover the truth behind the $8 billion legend, we have to travel back to the Jewish quarters of 18th century Poland, a world where trust was the only currency that mattered. You see, the image of a man simply writing checks from his own pocket is a bit of a stretch. In 1931, scholar Max Kohler dropped a historical bombshell. Salomon wasn't the revolution's personal ATM. He was a master of financial alchemy. He possessed the unique skill of turning complex European bills of exchange into the hard cash Washington's army desperately needed. So, where did the $8 billion figure come from? It turns out the legend was largely fueled by his son's 19th century campaign, a decades-long PR battle to claw back $3 million from a stingy Congress that refused to pay its debts. The bedrock of Haym Salomon's extraordinary financial acumen was laid in the most improbable setting imaginable, a humble, cramped wooden house in Lesno, Poland, where sheer survival necessitated the mastery of creating something substantial from virtually nothing. Lesno in 1740 wasn't merely poor, it was systematically impoverished. The town's Jewish quarter labored under oppressive restrictions that would have crushed most communities. Jews were barred from owning land outside specific, designated zones. They endured special taxes that ominously doubled every few years. They found themselves prohibited from engaging in most trades and guilds. Local authorities possessed the power to seize businesses on even the flimsiest, manufactured pretexts. Yet, against all odds, families like the Salomons not only survived, but cultivated sophisticated financial skills that would, in time, dramatically reshape international politics. Haym's father, Isaac Salomon, managed what outsiders might have dismissed as a simple grain and fabric enterprise. Yet, Isaac was, in reality, orchestrating one of Europe's most intricate and efficient informal banking networks. Jewish merchants spanning Poland, Prussia, and Austria maintained a complex, trust-based system of credit, currency exchange, and long-distance money transfers that ran parallel to, and often far more effectively than the official European banking houses of the era. What made this network truly revolutionary was its foundation. It operated entirely on unwavering trust and personal reputation, rather than on government backing or formal charters. A Jewish merchant in Lesno could issue a letter of credit that would be unequivocally honored in Prague, Vienna, or Frankfurt, because every participant in this robust network understood that defaulting meant immediate and absolute exile from the entire system. Isaac Salomon wasn't just selling grain. He was masterfully facilitating international finance through meticulously handwritten notes and unshakable personal guarantees. Young Haym absorbed this intricate system as naturally as he would a native language. By the tender age of 12, he could effortlessly calculate currency exchange rates between Polish zloty, Austrian thalers, and Prussian groschen entirely in his head. He grasped instinctively that a merchant's word held far more intrinsic value than mere silver. He understood that a solid reputation could move money faster than the swiftest horses, and that timely information about distant markets could generate immense profits for anyone shrewd enough to act upon it first. But Isaac Salomon imparted an even more invaluable lesson to his son: how to perceptively read people's financial desperation. In 1750s Poland, even affluent landowners frequently found themselves short of ready cash. The prevailing feudal economy meant that while nobles possessed vast estates, they often had very little liquid money. When harvests failed or protracted wars disrupted vital trade routes, aristocrats who owned thousands of acres would discreetly approach Jewish moneylenders for urgent loans. Isaac meticulously taught Haym to discern the subtle indicators, the quality of someone's clothing juxtaposed against their willingness to pay high interest, the crucial distinction between temporary cash flow problems and fundamental insolvency, and the sophisticated art of accurately pricing risk into the terms of a loan. Isaac would often advise in Yiddish, "A desperate man with excellent collateral is a veritable gold mine. A confident man with no assets, however, is a dangerous trap. Learn to tell the difference, and you will never know poverty." These lessons were put to the test constantly. Polish authorities regularly imposed emergency taxes on Jewish communities, often with as little as 24 hours' notice. The Salomon family would receive urgent word that they owed 50 zloty by sunset, or face the immediate confiscation of their property. Most families would fall into a panic. Isaac, however, calmly approached it as a solvable business problem. He would instantly calculate which of his outstanding loans could be recalled, which currencies could be swiftly converted, and which trusted merchants within his expansive network might advance money in exchange for future favors. Haym observed his father resolve these acute crises with both mathematical precision and remarkable diplomatic skill. Isaac never resorted to begging or pleading with Polish officials. Instead, he simply presented clear, mutually beneficial solutions. You require 50 zloty. Oh, I can reliably provide 60 zloty by 4p. In exchange for a formal written receipt and a fair 10% annual interest. The tax collectors, accustomed to tearful pleas and heated arguments, were so taken aback by Isaac's professional composure that they frequently accepted his terms. By the age of 16, Haym was adeptly handling these complex negotiations himself. His linguistic skills had expanded far beyond the immediate needs of the family business. He conversed fluently in German with Prussian traders, managed serviceable French with visiting merchants, and was rapidly acquiring English from British business contacts who passed through Lesno's bustling markets. More significantly, however, he had developed an intuitive, almost innate, understanding of what would later be formalized as international arbitrage. Haym noticed that British wool sold in Lesno at dramatically different prices than the identical wool in nearby German towns. He recognized that currency fluctuations meant Spanish silver purchased in Poland could be resold in Austria for a substantial 15 to 20% profit. Information concerning crop failures in distant regions could be leveraged to accurately predict commodity price changes weeks in advance. While other teenagers focused solely on local trades, Haym's mind was thinking continentally, strategically. In 1762, everything irrevocably changed. Frederick the Great's formidable armies swept through western Poland, and Lesno suddenly found itself directly in the throes of a brutal war zone. Jewish families faced a harrowing dilemma: flee immediately with whatever meager possessions they could carry, or risk capture by soldiers who notoriously viewed Jewish communities as convenient targets for rampant looting. Most families, understandably, fled in terror. Haym Salomon, however, calmly calculated. He liquidated the family's assets with astonishing speed and efficiency. Within a mere 3 days, Isaac had ingeniously converted their entire grain inventory, fabric stock, and all outstanding loans into easily portable wealth. Gold coins, precious gemstones, and reliable letters of credit with established banking houses in London, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt. The Salomon family did not flee like desperate refugees. They strategically relocated like savvy international investors. But young Haym was learning something even more profound than mere financial technique. He was witnessing firsthand how profound political instability could unleash massive opportunities for individuals capable of thinking clearly and strategically, while everyone else succumbed to panic. While Polish nobles frantically hid their silver in wells, and despairing merchants sold their goods for whatever pittance they could get, Haym Salomon was shrewdly acquiring discounted assets from desperate sellers and meticulously arranging to ship them to distant markets where prices had not yet collapsed. The war indelibly taught Haym that financial skill wasn't just about accumulating money. It was about maintaining crucial independence when established governments inevitably failed. A family possessing diversified international assets could withstand and survive political upheaval that utterly destroyed entire communities. Money prudently stored in multiple currencies and diverse countries proved infinitely safer than land, hereditary titles, or localized businesses. Most importantly, robust financial networks that seamlessly crossed national borders proved far more resilient and durable than any single nation's laws or protections. By 1764, when the immediate military threat had subsided, Haym had made a pivotal decision that would ultimately reshape the course of American history. He harbored no interest in simply rebuilding the family business in Poland. Instead, he yearned to test his exceptional skills in the bustling financial capitals of Europe, where the sophisticated techniques he'd painstakingly learned in Lesno could be applied on a scale his father had never even dared to imagine. Haym Salomon understood completely. His son had mastered every lesson that small-town Polish finance could impart. Now, Haym needed to comprehend how international money truly flowed, how vast governments borrowed and, crucially, repaid massive debts, and how a single individual with sufficient skill and strategic connections could profoundly influence the financial decisions of entire nations. Go to London first, Isaac sagely advised. Learn how the British meticulously move money around their vast empire. Then find a place where your unique skills can build something entirely new. Neither father nor son could possibly have imagined that something new would ultimately be the United States of America. When Haym Salomon first set foot on Wall Street in New York City in 1772, he was carrying far more than mere luggage. He was bringing with him a suite of advanced financial techniques that the vast majority of American colonists had never before witnessed. London had been a profound revelation. For 2 formative years, Salomon had immersed himself in the bustling financial district surrounding the Royal Exchange, diligently learning how British banking houses meticulously managed the intricate currency flows that kept their formidable global empire operating smoothly. He discovered that Britain's immense colonial wealth wasn't solely extracted through direct taxation and trade. Crucially, it was expertly leveraged through sophisticated financial instruments that amplified London's profits exponentially. The British had perfected something truly revolutionary. They artfully used colonial assets as robust collateral for lucrative European loans, then strategically deployed those very loans to finance aggressive military expansion. That, in turn, captured even more colonial assets. It was, in essence, a perpetual money-making machine that generated wealth at a pace far exceeding traditional conquest. Haym acutely realized that whoever held the reins of colonial finance invariably controlled colonial politics. Britain's formidable power in America was not merely military, it was fundamentally mathematical. But New York in 1772 laid bare a colossal weakness within this seemingly invincible system. Colonial merchants were being charged outrageous fees for even the most basic financial services, simply because they had no viable alternatives to British-controlled banks. Currency exchange rates were arbitrarily dictated by London houses that extracted whatever the market would bear. International letters of credit often took months to arrange and devoured a crippling 5 to 10% of the transaction's value. Most damaging of all, American traders lacked any direct access to European markets. Every transaction was forced to flow through British intermediaries, who added layer after layer of profit skimming. Salomon, ever the astute observer, perceived immense opportunity where other immigrants saw only insurmountable obstacles. His Polish heritage had meticulously taught him how to successfully operate complex financial networks without the need for government backing. His London experience had unequivocally demonstrated how international money genuinely circulated. His impressive linguistic skills meant he could communicate directly and effectively with Dutch, French, Spanish, and German traders who, despite being eager to conduct business in America, simply could not navigate the British-dominated financial system. While his office at 22 Wall Street would soon change history, Salomon's first step was far more practical. Early records don't list him as a financier, but as Haym Salomon, the distiller. In a frontier economy hungry for spirits, His European expertise in alcohol production was the cash cow that funded his jump into high finance. But here's the paradox. While he financed the very vision of America, we have no idea what he actually looked like. Every portrait or statue you see today is purely a product of an artist's imagination. His business model was elegantly simple. Offer American merchants the exact same financial services they were grudgingly receiving from British banks, but deliver them faster, cheaper, and with direct, unobstructed access to burgeoning European markets. The results were truly staggering. Salomon could convert currencies at rates that saved American traders a significant 15 to 20% compared to what British banks charged. He meticulously arranged international letters of credit in weeks, rather than the agonizing months it typically took. Most critically, he established direct, symbiotic trading relationships between American merchants and European suppliers, thereby effectively cutting British middlemen entirely out of transactions worth thousands of pounds. But Salomon wasn't merely competing with British banks. He was actively constructing an entirely alternative financial infrastructure that operated completely outside the pervasive reach of British control. His breakthrough innovation was what we would now recognize as correspondent banking. Salomon meticulously forged formal relationships with established banking houses in Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, and Madrid, thereby creating a robust network that could seamlessly transfer money from New York to Europe without ever needing to touch British institutions. A New York merchant could deposit Spanish silver with Salomon on a Monday and have equivalent credit readily available in Amsterdam by Friday, a speed far surpassing what British banks could achieve even for routine paperwork. This revolutionary network naturally attracted clients that British banks routinely refused to serve: Jewish merchants who faced systemic religious discrimination, French Catholic traders who were always viewed with deep suspicion, Spanish and Portuguese businessmen who were technically enemy aliens during the frequent European wars of the era, and, increasingly, American merchants who deeply resented British financial control. By 1774, Salomon's burgeoning client list read like a veritable who's who of colonial New York's most successful non-British traders: Aaron Lopez, the formidable Newport merchant prince; Jacob Franks, who controlled a significant portion of New York's lucrative fur trade; David Franks, Philadelphia's leading import-export dealer; and the influential Hayes family, who dominated southeastern retail trade. These were not merely random immigrants. They were actively laying the foundations of America's first alternative economy. But Haym was building something even more profoundly significant: genuine financial independence from Britain at the precise historical moment when political independence was transitioning from an unthinkable pipe dream to a tangible possibility. The sheer genius of Salomon's system became unmistakably apparent during the tumultuous 1773 Tea Act crisis, when American merchants orchestrated widespread boycotts of British goods. They urgently needed alternative suppliers, and fast. British banks, for obvious reasons, would never finance trade that actively undermined British policy. Salomon, however, could. His expansive European network meant that American merchants could pivot almost overnight from British suppliers to readily available Dutch, French, or Spanish alternatives. Financial independence had effectively transformed political resistance into a practical and sustainable endeavor. During the crucial months leading up to the inaugural Continental Congress, Salomon's bustling office evolved into an informal headquarters for colonial merchants who were actively plotting economic resistance to British policies. This wasn't because Salomon was initially overtly political. He wasn't. But rather because his unique financial network was the only reliable system capable of sustaining prolonged commercial opposition to Britain. Here's what made this truly revolutionary. Colonial resistance had historically always faltered because it was fundamentally economically unsustainable. American merchants simply couldn't afford to sever ties with British suppliers because they possessed no other reliable source of credit or international connections. Salomon had, quite accidentally, solved this intractable problem by creating a robust financial infrastructure that operated entirely independently of British control. By early 1775, something utterly unprecedented was unfolding in colonial finance. American merchants were conducting substantial international trade without utilizing British banks, British credit, or even British currency. Salomon's intricate network was processing transactions valued at tens of thousands of pounds annually, with money flowing through Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Paris instead of its traditional route through London. British authorities began to take notice. Colonial revenue derived from banking fees and currency exchange was plummeting significantly. Worse still, American merchants were rapidly developing direct, lasting relationships with European suppliers who had previously sold their goods exclusively through British intermediaries. The entrenched financial dependency that had for so long kept American colonies economically shackled to Britain was eroding with alarming speed. But Salomon was inadvertently creating something even more dangerous to British interests. He was conclusively proving that complex international finance could operate with remarkable efficiency and integrity without any British oversight whatsoever. Every successful transaction facilitated through his network undeniably demonstrated that American merchants simply did not require London banks to conduct profitable global business. Financial independence was now beginning to seem not just desirable, but entirely achievable. The political implications were blindingly obvious to anyone paying close attention. A colonial economy that could function independently of British finance could, quite naturally, support political independence from British rule. Salomon's business success was inadvertently providing the essential economic foundation for the looming American Revolution. When fighting finally erupted in Lexington and Concord, Haym Salomon faced a momentous decision that would ultimately determine not only his personal future, but also the very financial viability of American independence itself. British authorities were rapidly intensifying their crackdown on non-British financial networks, perceiving them as direct tools of political resistance. Salomon had a choice. He could close his vital European connections, limit his business strictly to British-approved transactions, and thus maintain his profitable, but politically compliant, enterprise. Restricted colonial practices. Alternatively, he could gamble everything on the seemingly impossible fantasy that a loose federation of rebellious British colonies might somehow forge themselves into a sovereign nation. The choice appeared stark and undeniable. On one side, the British Empire commanded the globe's most formidable navy, an unparalleled financial architecture, and a military legacy stretching across continents. On the other, the nascent Continental Congress possessed nothing but fervent patriotism, desperate resolve, and an absolute dearth of funds. Haym Salomon cast his lot with the Continental Congress. This proved to be the most lucrative financial decision in American history, and ultimately, the most personally devastating choice of his life. For Salomon and the tiny community of 500 Jews in the colonies, the revolution wasn't just about taxes. In Europe, a Jew had only 3 choices: convert, flee, or die. While the British offered mere tolerance, the rebels offered something revolutionary: true liberty. Salomon went all in because he saw America as a clean slate where his faith wouldn't make him a second-class citizen. British forces had just seized control of New York City, and Haym Salomon was about to discover the dire consequences of backing the losing side in a revolution. The Continental Army had executed a chaotic withdrawal from Manhattan, abandoning not just military hardware and provisions, but also scores of civilian sympathizers whose vocal support for independence now placed them in grave peril. British commanders exhibited no interest in drawing nuanced distinctions between active insurgents and supportive merchants. Any individual who had extended financial assistance to the Continental Congress was immediately branded an enemy combatant. Salomon's name, naturally, featured prominently on British arrest manifests. His thriving brokerage firm had processed transactions worth thousands of pounds for known rebels. His confidential exchanges with European banking houses contained explicit references to American independence and colonial self-determination phrases. British authorities unequivocally interpreted as evidence of treason. Most incriminating of all, his sophisticated financial network had empowered American merchants to sustain vital trade relationships while simultaneously orchestrating a boycott of British goods, a brazen act of economic warfare against the Crown. At precisely 6:00 MET on September 23rd, British soldiers encircled Salomon's Wall Street office. They found him composed, systematically incinerating documents, destroying records that could potentially implicate his clients in treasonous activities. The soldiers had anticipated uncovering a sprawling rebel financing conspiracy. Instead, they unearthed something far more potent. A Jewish immigrant who possessed a more profound understanding of British military finance than most British officers themselves. The irony was instant and utterly crushing. Captain Thomas Hughes, leader of the arrest squad, was in desperate need of someone capable of managing currency exchange and financial logistics for the British forces occupying New York. The city swarmed with British troops, requiring conversion of their sterling pay into local tender, arrangements for international money transfers, and expert navigation of the intricate exchange rates between British pounds, Spanish silver, and various colonial currencies. Hughes had, by sheer coincidence, apprehended the sole individual in New York City who could instantly resolve all these complex financial dilemmas. The practical solution was self-evident: compel Salomon to render financial services to the British while keeping him under constant vigilant surveillance as a suspected traitor. It was a strategy seemingly elegant, efficient, and one that utterly underestimated the man they sought to control. Haym Salomon would spend the subsequent 18 months as a prisoner employee working from a guarded office within British military headquarters, meticulously processing financial transactions for the very army striving to crush the cause he championed. But Salomon wasn't just building a business. He was building a dynasty. During his parole, he married 15-year-old Rachel Franks. Despite a 21-year age gap, this was a power move that bridged his immigrant grit with the political clout of the elite Franks family, a clan that had members serving both Washington and the British Crown. By day, he calculated exchange rates and facilitated international transfers for British officers. By night, he meticulously orchestrated the most intricate financial espionage operation in American history. Salomon's imprisonment, far from being a confinement, transmuted into a singular intelligence windfall. As the primary financial conduit for British forces in New York, he gained access to information that Continental commanders desperately craved. He learned precisely how much Britain was expending to sustain its military presence in America, offering critical insight into the probable duration of their war effort. He identified the international banks extending credit to British operations, revealing potential pressure points for future diplomatic intervention. Most importantly, he acquired an intimate knowledge of the exact mechanisms by which British forces moved money across their sprawling global empire. However, extracting this invaluable intelligence demanded a clandestine network capable of operating under intense British scrutiny. Salomon's stroke of genius lay in recognizing that his legitimate business dealings could perfectly camouflage his intelligence-gathering activities. British officers routinely needed to remit funds to family members in London, arrange payments for military provisions acquired from European manufacturers, and convert captured American currency into usable British funds. Every single transaction offered a unique opportunity to glean strategic information, all while maintaining the convincing facade of loyal service to British interests. The system Salomon meticulously devised was a masterpiece of subtlety. When British officers requested international transfers, he would pose seemingly routine questions about timing, recipients, and underlying purposes inquiries that, when aggregated, revealed broader patterns of British strategy. His currency exchange calculations necessitated tracking supply shipments, troop movements, and the British Army's spending priorities. His ongoing correspondence with European banking houses furnished him with unprecedented insight into Britain's war financing and the intricate dance of international diplomatic pressure. Within a mere 6 months, Salomon had compiled an exhaustive dossier on British financial vulnerability, a level of detail Continental commanders had never remotely possessed. Britain was bleeding approximately 400 €0 monthly to sustain its forces in America, a sum roughly equivalent to $2 billion annually in today's currency. They were funding this immense expenditure through loans from Dutch and German banking houses at interest rates that steadily escalated as European creditors grew increasingly wary of British overextension. Most critically, Salomon uncovered that British forces in America were operating on dangerously thin financial margins. They held sufficient funds to sustain current operations for perhaps another 18 months. But any substantial military expansion or protracted campaign would necessitate securing additional European loans that were becoming progressively harder to arrange. This critical intelligence needed to reach Continental commanders immediately. Yet communicating with rebel forces while under British surveillance demanded extraordinary ingenuity. Salomon's solution ingeniously leveraged the intrinsically international nature of his legitimate business. His correspondence with European banking houses was a routine and expected part of his operations. British censors diligently scrutinized his outgoing letters, but their focus was on detecting overt treasonous content, not intricately coded financial intelligence. Salomon engineered a system wherein routine business communications contained embedded intelligence pertaining to British financial activities. A letter dispatched to an Amsterdam banking house regarding currency exchange rates might include seemingly innocuous references to an increased demand for London drafts, a subtle signal that, in reality, indicated British troop buildups. Correspondence concerning international transfer fees could subtly convey information about critical British supply shipments. Discussions of European credit markets contained coded insights into British financial constraints. This stream of intelligence flowed from his European correspondence to American agents stationed in Paris, then through secure diplomatic channels to Continental Congress representatives, and finally reached military commanders who had previously operated with virtually no strategic intelligence concerning British capabilities. Beyond merely gathering intelligence, Salomon was constructing something even more enduringly valuable. He was diligently maintaining and expanding his crucial financial relationships with European banking houses, thereby preserving the credit connections that would prove indispensable when the Continental Congress inevitably required international loans. British authorities, in their short-sightedness, dismissed his European correspondence as ordinary business activity, posing no immediate threat. They utterly failed to comprehend that Salomon was, in fact, strengthening the very international financial networks that would ultimately underpin American economic independence. Every letter penned to Amsterdam, Frankfurt, or Paris was meticulously laying the groundwork for post-war American finance. By early 1778, Salomon's precarious situation had become untenable. British intelligence began to harbor suspicions that an unusual amount of strategic information was somehow reaching Continental forces. While they couldn't definitively prove Salomon was responsible, they initiated closer monitoring of his activities and started restricting his communications with European contacts. More ominously, Salomon's intelligence network had revealed that British commanders were planning a massive military escalation for 1778, an operation that would entail the mass arrest or execution of all suspected rebel sympathizers in occupied territories. His utility as a financial intermediary would offer no protection if British forces decided to neutralize all potential security threats. The escape plan Salomon devised was characteristically ingenious and sophisticated. Rather than attempting a dramatic flight that would instantly expose his intelligence activities, he orchestrated what appeared to be a routine business trip to Philadelphia, ostensibly to establish new banking relationships in the Continental Congress's capital city. British authorities readily approved the journey because Salomon's financial network had become indispensable to their own operations. They fully expected him to return within a few weeks, armed with expanded capabilities for managing British military finance. Instead, he vanished into the Continental Congress's informal financial apparatus, bringing with him 18 months of priceless strategic intelligence and his meticulously maintained relationships with European banking houses' assets that would prove absolutely crucial to American survival. Arriving in Philadelphia wasn't just a political defection. It was a reunion. Salomon quickly found himself at the center of a powerful Polish triumvirate, DT forming a lifelong bond with combat engineer Thaddeus Kosciuszko and the dashing cavalry commander Kazimierz Pulaski. Together, these three immigrants provided the engineering, the cavalry, and the cash that served as the backbone of the American dream. When British commanders finally grasped that their most invaluable financial intermediary had defected, they simultaneously realized that their intelligence security had been utterly compromised. The very man who had processed their most sensitive financial transactions was now working directly for the Continental Congress. Haym Salomon had masterfully transformed imprisonment into an unparalleled opportunity, isolation into a fertile ground for intelligence gathering, and forced collaboration into an extraordinary strategic advantage. He had conclusively demonstrated that financial expertise could pose a far greater threat to British interests than sheer military force. Now, he was poised to discover the true extent of financial warfare the Continental Congress could actually wage. When Haym Salomon entered Robert Morris's Philadelphia office in August 1778, he carried with him not only intelligence that would fundamentally reshape American strategy, but also access to financial resources the Continental Congress had never dared to imagine. Robert Morris, then serving as the unofficial superintendent of finance for the Continental Congress, was drowning in an impossible quagmire. The Congress possessed no inherent authority to levy taxes, no established credit with European banks, and no sustainable mechanism to fund military operations that were devouring approximately $5 million annually, a sum they simply did not possess. American currency was depreciating so catastrophically that Continental soldiers were outright rejecting paper money as payment, demanding food, clothing, or hard silver instead. Morris had desperately attempted to finance the revolution through a patchwork of personal loans, arbitrary seizures of private property, and increasingly frantic appeals to state governments, many of which were themselves bankrupt. The entire system was failing disastrously, and everyone involved understood that an impending financial collapse would extinguish American independence long before British military might could. Salomon's arrival, however, fundamentally altered the trajectory of everything. His extensive European banking connections meant that the Continental Congress could potentially tap into international credit markets that had been entirely inaccessible to official American government representatives. His crucial intelligence about British financial limitations unveiled strategic opportunities that American military commanders had simply not recognized. Most importantly, his unparalleled network of Jewish and international merchants represented a completely untapped wellspring of domestic financing for Continental operations. Yet, Salomon possessed something even more profoundly valuable, a comprehensive plan for financing American independence that was entirely independent of congressional authority, state cooperation, or even international diplomacy. The system he proposed was brilliantly straightforward. Instead of the Continental Congress attempting to negotiate massive loans directly from European governments, most of whom viewed American independence as an exceedingly dubious investment, Salomon would orchestrate private financing through his established network of international merchants and banking houses. These loans would be secured not by formal government backing, but by the personal guarantees of individual American political leaders. The sheer brilliance of this approach was its ability to bypass all the political and diplomatic obstacles that had rendered traditional government-to-government financing an impossibility. European bankers, who would unequivocally refuse to lend money to the rebellious British colonies as a governmental entity, were often quite willing to extend credit to Robert Morris personally, or to other individual American leaders who could furnish adequate collateral or credible personal guarantees. Morris immediately grasped the revolutionary implications of this scheme. American independence could now be financed privately, leveraging international capital markets without requiring formal recognition of American sovereignty by European governments. Financial independence could, astonishingly, precede political independence by years, thereby providing the essential economic foundation needed to secure ultimate military victory. Within weeks, Salomon had successfully arranged the first significant international loan for the American independence fighters, 20 DOUE French livres, advanced by a prominent Paris banking house. Secured against Robert Morris's personal guarantee, the transaction was shrewdly structured as private commercial credit rather than political financing, meaning it did not violate French neutrality, while still channeling desperately needed funds to Continental operations. This initial success, however, was merely a proof of concept. Salomon was constructing something far more ambitious, the very first comprehensive alternative financing system designed for a revolutionary government. His burgeoning network now encompassed influential banking houses in Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, Madrid, and even London, all willing to advance credit for American operations. It included Jewish merchants in key American cities like Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah, capable of providing vital domestic financing and logistical support. Furthermore, it comprised international traders who could supply essential military equipment and provisions in exchange for future payment guarantees. Most significantly, it connected with European manufacturers who were willing to accept American agricultural products as collateral for current loans. The entire system functioned much like an 18th century precursor to modern shadow banking. Transactions were meticulously structured as private commercial deals, not as government financing. International connections were maintained through established merchant networks, rather than formal diplomatic channels. Crucially, risk was intelligently distributed among dozens of individual lenders, rather than being concentrated within major government institutions. By early 1779, Salomon was processing financial transactions for Continental operations that collectively exceeded $500 EUO0 annually, a sum roughly equivalent to $50 million in contemporary terms. The Continental Congress was, quite literally, fighting the formidable British Empire using private credit meticulously arranged by a Polish Jewish immigrant who had been in America for less than 7 years. The sheer sophistication of Salomon's operations became strikingly evident during the 1779 British assault on Charleston. Continental forces defending the city urgently required immediate supplies and reinforcements. Yet official supply lines were completely severed. Traditional financing mechanisms would have necessitated congressional approval, state cooperation, and potentially months of arduous diplomatic negotiations. Salomon's agile network delivered within a staggering 72 hours. He swiftly arranged emergency credit with Spanish merchants in New Orleans, who then shipped vital supplies up the Mississippi River. He meticulously coordinated with Jewish merchants within Charleston itself, who provided immediate local financing and crucial logistical support. He expertly managed complex currency conversions and international transfers that enabled supplies to flow seamlessly from Europe, the Caribbean, and other American regions, entirely bypassing British-controlled shipping or financial networks. The remarkable speed and efficiency with which Salomon's system operated revealed a profound truth about the nature of 18th century finance. Private merchant networks could move money, goods, and information far more rapidly than cumbersome government institutions, precisely because they operated on the bedrock of personal relationships. Rather than rigid, bureaucratic procedures, trust and reputation could effectively substitute for legal enforcement. Profit motives, it turned out, could align international cooperation far more effectively than any political treaty. But Salomon was forging something even more strategically valuable than just an efficient supply chain. He was irrefutably demonstrating that American financial independence was not merely an aspiration, but an achievable reality, one that did not require British institutional support. Every successful transaction facilitated through his network unequivocally proved that American merchants could readily access international credit, competently manage complex currency conversions, and cultivate sophisticated commercial relationships without relying on British banks or the backing of the British government. The very financial infrastructure for an independent American economy was being meticulously constructed in real time, utilizing private capital and the power of personal relationships. The intelligence value of Salomon's expansive network was equally significant. His constant correspondence throughout Europe provided invaluable insights into British borrowing patterns, the intricacies of European diplomatic negotiations, and prevailing international opinion regarding the prospects of American independence. Leaders of the Continental Congress, thanks to Salomon, often possessed a more detailed understanding of European politics than many European government officials themselves, simply because Salomon's financial network transcended all conventional political boundaries. But every hero needs a legend, and for Salomon, that legend was born on the holiest day of the Jewish year. While his financial machine ran on cold logic, the stories that survived him were often colored by faith and mercy. One such tale places him at his most vulnerable moment. Caught between his God and his new country, the legend says, Washington's desperate plea reached Salomon on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. He supposedly left the synagogue mid-prayer to raise $20. While it makes for a powerful story, historians now label this as pious fiction. However, his true impact wasn't found in a dramatic public exit, but in the quiet, unsung shadows of history, like when he gave a silent bequest to Army Surgeon Bodo Otto, allowing the veteran to rebuild his medical practice when the government left him with nothing. By 1780, an unprecedented phenomenon in revolutionary history was unfolding. American independence was being financed more efficiently and sustainably than British efforts to suppress it. Salomon's meticulous calculations indicated that his private financing network possessed the potential to support Continental operations indefinitely. Meanwhile, British government financing was becoming increasingly strained, and, remarkably, European creditors were beginning to perceive American independence as a potentially profitable investment rather than a highly risky speculation. Most significantly, American financial independence was actively diminishing British strategic advantages and simultaneously generating powerful international momentum for American political independence. However, this extraordinary success was simultaneously creating an equally extraordinary problem. Haym Salomon was becoming personally responsible for an escalating mountain of debts liabilities that surpassed the annual revenue of most European nations. His private guarantees, personal loans, and individual credit commitments were rapidly approaching $600, a sum roughly equivalent to $60 million in modern terms, rendered comparatively inept. The very individual who had championed American financial self-reliance now posed an unforeseen challenge to the nation's ongoing economic progress. As 1784 dawned, Salomon was confronted with an agonizing dilemma: either incrementally withdraw from American government finance, thereby incurring catastrophic personal losses on his outstanding loans, or persist in extending the vital credit necessary to preserve American financial stability at the dire risk of his own total personal financial ruin. The decision appeared utterly intractable. A reduction in his involvement threatened to plunge American governmental operations into chaos at a pivotal juncture in the fledgling nation's evolution. Conversely, maintaining his financial commitments could utterly devastate his personal fortune and dismantle the intricate network that had so painstakingly underpinned American independence. Haym Salomon had dedicated 6 arduous years to meticulously constructing the financial bedrock upon which the United States was founded. Now, he stood on the precipice of understanding the fate of that infrastructure's architect. Once the nation he built deemed him dispensable. By 1784, Haym Salomon's daily influence over the functioning of American government eclipsed that of any elected official, cabinet member, or foreign diplomat. Yet, astonishingly, this profound sway remained largely unknown to the average American citizen. His control was neither ostentatious nor overtly visible. There were no grand public pronouncements, no ceremonial displays, nor rousing political speeches. Instead, Salomon's power manifested through the subtle yet indispensable mechanisms that underpinned the actual day-to-day operations of government: managing payroll, orchestrating international transactions, securing emergency funding, and overseeing debt. When Congress found itself needing to disburse administrative salaries, it routinely drew upon Salomon's extensive credit lines. When federal officials required conversions of international currency, they leveraged his sophisticated European correspondent network. And whenever government operations faced their frequent cash flow crises, they invariably turned to his unparalleled emergency financing capabilities. the American government had, in essence, grown utterly reliant on one man's private financial resources and vast international connections. The sheer scale of this dependence was truly astounding, surpassing even the formidable standards Salomon himself had established during the intense exigencies of wartime. Federal government payrolls were processed through accounts personally guaranteed by Salomon. International diplomatic expenditures were covered by advances he meticulously arranged through leading European banking houses. Military pensions for Continental officers were disbursed using credit facilities he had painstakingly set up with a broad network of domestic merchants. Even the government's acquisition of supplies, equipment, and services flowed through commercial networks that operated predominantly via his correspondent relationships. Robert Morris, still nominally holding the reins of federal financial operations, privately conceded that his own department would grind to a halt without Salomon's unwavering support. The Bank of North America, theoretically the cornerstone of American institutional finance, managed less than half the transaction volume that Salomon's private network routinely handled. Ostensibly, government financial institutions existed on paper, but in practical terms, the nation's financial lifeblood remained overwhelmingly channeled through the private arrangements Salomon either controlled or facilitated. But Salomon's influence transcended mere routine financial dealings. His formidable international connections furnished American political leaders with crucial intelligence on European diplomatic developments, information simply unobtainable through official governmental channels. His correspondent relationships facilitated informal international negotiations, often laying the groundwork for more formal diplomatic initiatives. His incisive financial analysis profoundly shaped American policy decisions regarding taxation, public spending, and international trade. Congressional leaders habitually sought his counsel before making major policy decisions, recognizing his uncanny ability to predict financial consequences with far greater accuracy than government economic advisors. Salomon's influence wasn't just based on cash. It was built on a foundation of sacred brotherhood. As a master mason in Philadelphia's Lodge No. 2, Salomon shared the same secret handshakes and sat in the same smoke-filled rooms as George Washington and his top generals. This bond of brotherhood often transcended the official politics of the era, granting him direct access to the most powerful decision-makers. However, while Salomon enjoyed this elite connection, he remained a second-class citizen in the eyes of the law. At the time, Pennsylvania law required a religious test oath that effectively barred Jews from holding public office. Salomon's true war wasn't just for money. It was for equality. He did not hesitate to petition the government to tear down these discriminatory walls, famously declaring, "I am a Jew. It is my own nation," as he fought to ensure that the religious liberty promised by the Revolution applied to everyone. It was this unique standing simultaneously, a brother in a secret society and a champion for ethnic rights, that solidified the trust necessary for leaders to accept his sharp financial analyses. Salomon's assessments of European credit markets directly influenced American diplomatic strategy toward France, Spain, and Holland. His recommendations concerning currency policy and taxation systems were, more often than not, adopted verbatim, simply because no comparable alternative expertise was available. Without holding a single official government position, Haym Salomon had simultaneously become America's unofficial economic czar, its de facto central banker, and its premier financial intelligence analyst. But his real war wasn't just for money. It was for equality. At the time, Pennsylvania law required a religious test oath that effectively banned Jews from holding public office. Salomon didn't just write checks. he petitioned the government to tear down these discriminatory walls. He famously declared, "I am a Jew. It is my own nation," as he fought to ensure that the religious liberty promised by the revolution applied to everyone. The truly extraordinary nature of his pervasive influence was laid bare during the heated congressional debates of 1784 concerning federal taxation authority. The Articles of Confederation had severely curtailed federal taxation powers, a restriction that consistently plagued government finance and debt repayment efforts. While various proposals aimed at bolstering federal revenue generation were put forth, congressional representatives found themselves deadlocked, unable to coalesce around specific approaches or implementation mechanisms. Salomon's meticulous analysis cut through months of partisan bickering with devastating clarity. He meticulously calculated that federal government expenses amounted to approximately $5 million annually, while existing revenue sources barely provided a third of that, less than $1 million. This staggering shortfall was being covered by borrowing, which, crucially, was accumulating at a pace far exceeding what any conceivable taxation system could realistically service. He warned that without fundamental revisions to either federal spending or its taxation authority, the American government faced imminent insolvency within 3 years. More gravely, Salomon underscored that international creditors were already beginning to perceive American government debt as an increasingly precarious investment. European banking houses were demanding higher interest rates and significantly shorter repayment terms for any new American obligations. Consequently, international trade credit became both more expensive and considerably harder to secure. America's burgeoning financial reputation was rapidly eroding among precisely those European institutions whose support the nascent nation desperately needed for its long-term economic development. His proposed solution was a stroke of political genius, coupled with unparalleled financial sophistication. Rather than embarking on the seemingly insurmountable task of increasing federal taxation authority, a measure that would necessitate politically unachievable constitutional amendments, Salomon ingeniously suggested utilizing international trade financing to generate federal revenue indirectly. His brilliant strategy capitalized on America's inherent comparative advantages in abundant agricultural exports and rich natural resources to secure long-term European credit lines. These lines, in turn, promised to deliver a predictable stream of federal income. The innovative plan stipulated that international trade contracts would incorporate provisions for federal revenue sharing, thereby establishing systematic income streams that bypassed the need for direct taxation. European banking relationships could be meticulously structured to furnish both essential commercial financing and government revenue generation through seamlessly integrated transaction processing. Congressional leaders were captivated by this audacious proposal, as it offered a lifeline to resolve the intractable federal revenue crisis without demanding politically impossible constitutional reforms. European correspondents, too, were keenly interested, recognizing the systematic access it provided to American agricultural and resource exports, which commanded substantial profits in their home markets. International bankers particularly lauded the clever risk distribution and the multiple revenue streams, factors that significantly mitigated the perceived default risk of the American government. Remarkably, within a mere 6 months, Salomon had successfully negotiated preliminary agreements with influential banking houses in Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Paris. These groundbreaking accords were poised to furnish the federal government with robust revenue streams totaling approximately $800 annually, all channeled through an innovative system of integrated international trade financing. Crucially, these agreements were meticulously structured as commercial contracts rather than traditional government bonds, a strategic maneuver that skillfully circumvented constitutional limitations while simultaneously ensuring a predictable federal income. The resounding success of these negotiations unveiled a profound truth about Salomon's unparalleled influence. He possessed the unique ability to accomplish through private financial arrangements what the nascent American government was utterly incapable of achieving through official diplomatic channels. European governments, previously unwilling to negotiate formal treaties with American representatives, readily consented to extensive commercial relationships, personally brokered and arranged by Salomon. International banking houses, which had deemed official American government obligations excessively risky, were prepared to extend substantial credit, confident in Salomon's personal guarantees and unparalleled commercial acumen. Similarly, European manufacturers and traders, who typically shied away from official American government contracts, enthusiastically participated in the vibrant commercial networks that Salomon coordinated. In essence, American financial independence was being forged and secured, not through its fledgling governmental institutions, but through highly effective private arrangements. Yet, this extraordinary breadth of influence simultaneously generated equally extraordinary risks, not only for Salomon himself, but also for the very trajectory of American political development. His personal financial exposure was now rapidly nearing an astounding $700, 000, a sum roughly equivalent to a staggering $7, $1 billion in contemporary value. European creditors, observing this intricate web, began to perceive American governmental stability as directly contingent upon Salomon's sustained involvement and formidable financial capacity. Domestically, political leaders grew increasingly uneasy, confronting the stark reality that crucial government operations hinged precariously on the private resources and personal relationships of a single individual. Even more disturbingly, Salomon's undeniable efficacy served to underscore fundamental deficiencies within America's institutional development. Government financial institutions, in their nascent form, simply could not replicate the efficiency, the global connectivity, or the sophisticated transaction capabilities that his private network routinely delivered. American diplomatic efforts often proved inferior to the robust international relationships he cultivated through his extensive commercial activities. Moreover, federal revenue generation mechanisms were demonstrably less effective than the innovative income streams he could orchestrate through his private financial ingenuity. The newly formed United States, while proudly showcasing its impressive political independence, remained paradoxically beholden to financial systems that functioned entirely outside the bounds of democratic oversight and institutional accountability. By late 1784, this inherent contradiction was rapidly approaching a point of political unsustainability. As the line between private credit and public debt blurred, Salomon reached the point of no return. Whether these were his personal funds or credit he brokered through his vast network, the legal liability remained the same. The United States was tied to Salomon for its very survival. The escalating tension was poised to ignite the most profound crisis of Salomon's illustrious career, and, arguably, the most regrettable chapter in early American financial history. December 1784. Haym Salomon meticulously opened his formidable account books, his gaze falling upon a figure that would have instilled terror in the heart of any other financier across America. He faced a staggering $658,700 in outstanding loans to the United States government, compounded by an additional $200,000 in guaranteed obligations. Yet, the truly mind-boggling dimension of Salomon's predicament wasn't merely the colossal absolute sum of his government lending. It was, rather, the astonishing percentage of total federal obligations that rested personally within his portfolio. A rigorous analysis of government debt records unequivocally revealed that Salomon controlled approximately 75% of all non-European American government debt. The United States now owed him more money than it owed to its own constituent states, its network of domestic suppliers, and every other private creditor in the nation. Combined, Haym Salomon had, unequivocally, ascended to the status of the single largest creditor to the United States of America. His personal lending portfolio effectively served as a confidential roster of America's political elite. James Madison, for instance, owed him $1, $200 for personal expenses incurred during his congressional tenure. Thomas Jefferson had borrowed $500 to cover various diplomatic costs. Edmund Randolph was indebted for $800, covering legal fees and living expenses. Alexander Hamilton had received multiple advances from Salomon, collectively amounting to $1 for both personal needs and official endeavors. Even the revered George Washington had borrowed $300 for miscellaneous expenses during the crucial presidential transition period. Beyond these individual loans to prominent figures, Salomon had also personally guaranteed payments for federal government operations totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. This encompassed everything from military pensions and administrative salaries to international diplomatic expenses, federal office costs, and routine government purchasing, all funded through intricate credit arrangements he had personally secured with influential European banking houses and a vast network of domestic merchants. The sheer breadth and depth of his financial involvement in American government operations were truly without precedent in the annals of modern financial history. No single individual, before or since, has ever commanded such a substantial percentage of a national government's debt, while simultaneously maintaining such extensive, intricate operational involvement in the daily mechanics of national finance. Yet, Salomon wasn't merely a passive holder of government debt. He was, in fact, actively creating it. His ceaseless financing of federal operations relentlessly generated new government obligations at a pace that far outstripped the repayment of existing debts. Emergency loans for unforeseen expenses, crucial advances for international transactions, guarantees for commercial contracts, and essential credit arrangements for routine operations were collectively contributing an alarming $15 to $20 monthly to the nation's escalating debt levels. The financial mathematics were rapidly turning ominous. At these current rates of accumulation, the total American government debt owed to Salomon was projected to surpass $1 million within 2 short years. Interest obligations alone would demand federal budget allocations that drastically exceeded current government revenues. The burden of debt service threatened to consume such an overwhelming proportion of federal resources that essential government operations could become financially untenable. More problematically still, Salomon's extensive lending practices were forging perilous concentrations of financial risk, jeopardizing both his own vast fortune and the delicate stability of the American government. His personal wealth was, by this point, almost entirely committed to American government obligations. The intricate network of European banking relationships he had meticulously cultivated over 15 years was now increasingly entangled and committed to American government financing. Furthermore, his domestic merchant network was extending credit based primarily on government debt securities that, in a worst-case scenario, might prove utterly uncollectible. If the American government were to default on its obligations to Salomon, the ensuing financial cascade would undoubtedly obliterate the entire alternative financial infrastructure that had so valiantly sustained American independence. Conversely, should Salomon's personal finances collapse, American government operations would immediately plunge into an existential crisis, as no alternative financing sources possessed equivalent capacity or international connectivity to fill the void. This profound interdependence had reached such an extensive degree that Salomon's financial stability and American government stability were, for all intents and purposes, inextricably linked. Their fates were practically identical. Either both would succeed in concert, or both would inevitably fail together. Indeed, astute European observers were already beginning to remark upon this highly unusual state of affairs. French diplomatic reports, for instance, candidly noted that American financial independence seemed to rest precariously on private arrangements involving Jewish banking interests, operating entirely beyond conventional government oversight. British intelligence analysts went so far as to suggest that American government stability could potentially be subverted not by direct assaults on official institutions, but by strategically targeting specific private financiers. Spanish merchants who had extended credit via Salomon's extensive network began urgently requesting clarification. Were their contracts truly with official American government entities, or merely with Salomon personally? Similarly, Dutch banking houses, once satisfied with Salomon's personal assurances, now began to demand explicit government guarantees for obligations previously secured by his individual commitments. International confidence in American financial management was undeniably eroding, fueled by a growing awareness that the very operations of government relied so disproportionately on private arrangements that seemed inherently unsustainable in the long run. Influence, however, bred envy. Salomon was dragged into a vicious press war by rivals like Mears Fisher, who publicly accused him of typical Jewish usury. Salomon refused to be a silent victim. He used the media to fire back, defending his honor and his faith in a high-stakes battle for public opinion that showed the dark underbelly of the new nation's gratitude. Domestic political leaders were equally troubled by the far-reaching implications of Salomon's financial dominance. Congressional representatives fretted that an over-reliance on one individual's credit created undeniable potential for conflicts of interest, which could profoundly compromise the nation's policy independence. Treasury officials, for their part, openly questioned whether government financial operations ought to be so heavily dependent on private networks that, by their nature, operated according to commercial priorities, rather than the broader objectives of public policy. Alexander Hamilton, then emerging as a fervent advocate for robust federal financial institutions, privately voiced his concern that Salomon's very effectiveness, ironically, was impeding the development of essential government capabilities that would be indispensable for America's long-term financial independence, as long as private arrangements could swiftly resolve immediate financial exigencies. There was scant political impetus to invest in institutional alternatives, even if such alternatives were inherently more suitable for a democratic form of governance. The situation thus forged a fundamental contradiction in American financial development. While Salomon's private network undeniably furnished capabilities that nascent government institutions simply could not rival, a permanent dependence on private financing was fundamentally irreconcilable with the democratic accountability and institutional self-sufficiency that revolutionary political theory so adamantly demanded. By early 1785, this escalating tension was generating considerable political pressure for a drastic reduction in government dependence on Salomon's financing. Irrespective of the foreseeable practical consequences, numerous congressional representatives began vociferously advocating for the systematic repayment of obligations to private creditors, commencing with the nation's largest debt holders. Concurrently, Robert Morris was diligently formulating comprehensive plans for establishing robust government financial institutions designed to offer viable alternatives to the prevailing private merchant networks. State governments, too, were increasingly urged to shoulder a greater share of responsibility for federal financing, thereby aiming to diminish reliance on private credit sources. However, these politically driven initiatives entirely overlooked a stark and crucial financial reality. The American government simply could not afford to repay Salomon without simultaneously borrowing even more money to finance that very repayment. Total obligations surpassed current federal revenues by such staggering margins that any attempt at debt reduction would necessitate either massive, politically unpalatable taxation increases or additional borrowing that would only exacerbate the underlying financial instability. More fundamentally, the daily operations of the American government had become so profoundly intertwined with Salomon's ongoing financing that an immediate repayment, even if the funds were miraculously available, would inevitably trigger an unprecedented operational crisis. His extensive network meticulously processed routine transactions, expertly managed international currency exchanges, deftly facilitated commercial relationships, and unfailingly provided emergency credit capabilities functions that fledgling government institutions simply lacked the capacity to replicate swiftly or effectively. A genuine reduction in dependence on Salomon's financing would demand years of meticulous institutional development, a process that, ironically, could not possibly unfold without his continued private financial support throughout the transition period. The underlying mathematics presented a brutal paradox. The American government desperately required Salomon's continued financing to cultivate the very capabilities that would, in time, render his financing obsolete. Yet, continued financing would only further inflate his debt holdings and expand his political influence to levels that were rapidly becoming democratically unacceptable. Haym Salomon had inadvertently constructed an impossible situation. He was simultaneously indispensable for America's very financial survival and, paradoxically, a significant impediment to its mature political development. The man who had been instrumental in securing American independence was now inadvertently becoming an obstacle to the nation's vital institutional growth. As 1785 progressed, it became chillingly evident that this profound contradiction could not possibly be sustained. The American government would eventually confront a critical juncture, compelled to choose between safeguarding its nascent financial stability and preserving its political independence from the influence of powerful private financial control. The trajectory set by this pivotal decision would not only seal Salomon's personal destiny, but also fundamentally define the very nature of American financial institutions for countless generations to come. On January 6, 1785, Haym Salomon passed away suddenly in his Philadelphia residence. He left behind a grieving widow, 4 young children, and a trove of financial records that unequivocally demonstrated the United States government's indebtedness to his estate, a sum of $650, 700, an amount roughly equivalent to $80 million in today's purchasing power. The precise circumstances surrounding his death continue to be shrouded in mystery. Salomon was a seemingly healthy 44-year-old, actively engaged in managing extensive financial operations that demanded his unwavering attention. While some accounts point to tuberculosis as the cause, others attribute it to sheer exhaustion from relentless overwork, and a few theories subtly suggest that the immense stress from escalating financial pressures may have triggered his abrupt collapse. What remains undeniably clear, however, is the sequence of events that unfolded immediately following his death. The inventory of his private estate, filed in the Philadelphia Probate Court on February 15, 1785, revealed the cold, hard truth. His legacy wasn't found in a vault of gold, but in a mountain of worthless paper, one that's $233 in loan office certificates, over $199, $214 in liquidated Continental dollars, and thousands more in state notes. In total, his estate held more than $353 in government IOUs, receipts for a revolution that the new nation was already trying to forget. The United States government swiftly initiated a systematic campaign to deny any financial obligation to the Salomon family whatsoever. Within mere weeks of Salomon's funeral, prominent congressional leaders began asserting that his loans had been personal arrangements made with individual officials rather than legitimate debts incurred by the government. Treasury administrators advanced the argument that his financial support constituted speculative investments inherently carrying a risk of loss, rather than secured government debt. Simultaneously, legal advisors contended that the documentation of his transactions was insufficient to definitively prove the government's liability for repayment. The remarkable speed and synchronized nature of these denials strongly imply that American political leaders had been strategically planning to repudiate Salomon's claims even before his demise. Rachel Salomon, his widow, found herself thrust into an utterly impossible predicament. Her husband's entire estate consisted almost exclusively of government debt obligations, which officials were now brazenly claiming simply did not exist. Their home, their business assets, their life savings, everything they owned, was inextricably tied up in the loans and guarantees that had crucially financed American independence. Yet these were now being dismissed as mere worthless paper. The family's financial security evaporated overnight. Rachel was left with 4 young children, all under the age of 12, no discernible sources of income, and burgeoning debt obligations to European creditors who had advanced funds based on her husband's personal guarantees. The very man who had been instrumental in financing American independence had, through the government's actions, left his family in abject poverty, while the nation he had saved brazenly denied owing them a single cent. Yet, the Salomon family's financial ruin was merely the precursor to a far broader betrayal that would fundamentally alter the course of American financial history. Salomon's extensive European correspondent network quickly began demanding immediate clarification regarding the American government obligations he had personally guaranteed. Influential banking houses in Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Paris, which had confidently extended credit based on his sterling reputation, now urgently questioned whether these commitments would be honored by American government entities or summarily dismissed as uncollectible personal debts. The American government's response was nothing short of devastating in its profound cynicism. Federal officials asserted that Salomon's European agreements were exclusively private commercial arrangements, carrying no government backing or official obligation. International loans, which had sustained American operations for 6 crucial years, were suddenly reclassified as speculative investments made by foreign creditors who had supposedly assumed excessive risk. European banking houses, which had placed their trust in American financial integrity based on Salomon's personal relationships, were shocked to discover that the American government was prepared to abandon those relationships instantaneously whenever their continuation became politically or financially inconvenient. The international financial repercussions were immediate and severe. European creditors who had steadfastly supported American independence through Salomon's network promptly began demanding the immediate repayment of all outstanding obligations. international trade credit arrangements, which had been vital in facilitating American commerce, were abruptly canceled or drastically restructured with significantly higher risk premiums. Banking relationships, painstakingly cultivated over many years, were terminated within months. America's financial standing and reputation in European markets collapsed as completely and abruptly as the Salomon family's personal finances. However, the domestic consequences proved equally detrimental to American financial development. Salomon's merchant network had provided an essential financial infrastructure that nascent government institutions were entirely unprepared to replace. His domestic lending relationships had not only supported federal operations, but also sustained state governments, municipal authorities, and private businesses that relied heavily on his credit facilities and efficient transaction processing capabilities. With the sudden disappearance of his intricate network, American domestic finance confronted severe disruptions that persisted for years. Transaction processing capabilities, which had operated efficiently through private merchant relationships, now suddenly necessitated expensive and inefficient government bureaucratic procedures. International currency exchange, once handled routinely through Salomon's correspondent network, became a complex and costly endeavor for American businesses. Emergency credit, previously available within hours through his personal guarantees, now required months of arduous negotiations with institutions that often lacked either sufficient capital or the necessary expertise. The profound loss of Salomon's financial network inadvertently triggered precisely the institutional crisis that American political leaders had so desperately sought to avoid. Yet, their preferred solution was to outright deny the existence of the crisis. Rather than address its fundamental underlying causes, Alexander Hamilton, who was rapidly emerging as the primary architect of American financial policy, adopted a particularly cynical approach to the entire Salomon situation. Hamilton himself had personally borrowed money from Salomon on multiple occasions and had relied extensively on his financial expertise during the formative period of federal financial institutions. But when Salomon's estate subsequently sought repayment, Hamilton controversially argued that those loans had been private arrangements that could not legitimately be considered government obligations. While Hamilton's position was arguably legally defensible, it was morally indefensible. He unscrupulously leveraged knowledge he had gained through his personal relationship with Salomon to design government financial policies that deliberately excluded any compensation for Salomon's immense contributions to American financial independence. The very man who had learned the intricacies of international finance from Salomon's expertise then meticulously created institutional systems that would deny Salomon's family any benefit from that very expertise. The betrayal was systematic and chillingly comprehensive. Every single aspect of Salomon's financial contribution to American independence was either denied, minimized, or disingenuously attributed to other sources. Congressional records that meticulously documented his loans were arbitrarily declared insufficient evidence of government obligation. Treasury accounts that clearly showed his financing were conveniently reclassified as private commercial transactions. International agreements he had painstakingly arranged were described as mere speculative investments rather than essential government operations. Most cynically, American political leaders began audaciously claiming credit for financial innovations that Salomon had, in fact, personally developed. The international correspondent banking relationships that would become the very foundation of American foreign trade were recast as government initiatives rather than the product of private merchant networks. Currency management techniques pioneered by Salomon were attributed to nascent federal financial institutions. Even specific financing arrangements he had meticulously created were retroactively claimed as early examples of American financial sophistication. The historical revisionism was as complete and sweeping as the financial betrayal itself. Salomon's indispensable role in American independence was being systematically erased from official records and public memory, all while his family grappled with the crushing poverty that resulted directly from their profound financial sacrifice for American independence. But perhaps the most devastating consequence of this betrayal was the precedent it established for the American government's future treatment of inconvenient creditors and political allies. The Salomon case vividly demonstrated that the American government was willing to abandon financial obligations whenever honoring them became politically or economically inconvenient. International partners who had implicitly trusted American commitments learned a harsh lesson. Those commitments were reliable only for as long as they remained convenient. Domestic supporters who had made significant financial sacrifices for American independence discovered that their crucial contributions would be conveniently forgotten when acknowledging them became burdensome. The message resonated loudly and clearly. Serving American independence was financially perilous, and American gratitude was, at best, temporary. This disturbing pattern, leveraging private innovation to build public institutions, then discarding the innovators when their contributions become politically inconvenient, has become a recurring and regrettable theme in American development. We see this with indigenous allies who provided crucial military support, only to be heartlessly abandoned once their alliance became burdensome. We see it in immigrant communities that provided essential labor and expertise, only to be systematically excluded when their social integration became controversial. Even international partners who enabled American expansion were repudiated the moment their support became too expensive. The Salomon precedent tragically established a bitter reality. Serving American interests is a peril to both your finances and your future, because this nation's gratitude is fleeting and its institutional memory is regrettably selective. But perhaps the most disturbing part of Salomon's story is how it exposes America's willingness to sacrifice moral principles for political convenience, even when the evidence of his indispensable contributions to independence remains overwhelming and incontrovertible. Rachel Salomon devoted the remaining 40 years of her life to an unyielding battle for recognition of her husband's contributions and repayment of her family's crushing financial losses. She appealed to Congress, petitioned federal courts, and tirelessly contacted international institutions, all in a desperate quest for justice for her husband's sacrifice and her family's financial destruction. Every appeal was rejected. Every petition was denied. Every single request for compensation was dismissed, typically with legal technicalities that conveniently obscured the fundamental moral issue at hand. The United States had been forged with money it now flatly refused to repay to the very family that had provided it. While Haym died in the shadows of debt, actually owing the bank $560, the pulse of his genius refused to fade. His eldest son, Ezekiel, would later rise to command the United States branch bank in New Orleans, proving that the Salomon financial DNA was unbreakable. And in the heat of World War II, his name was finally etched into steel on a Liberty ship, the SS Haym Salomon, a late, silent apology from the very nation he gave his life to save. Salomon's physical assets were seized, but his financial DNA survived. The very systems that betrayed him would eventually become the invisible blueprints for the modern global economy. For an astonishing 237 years, the United States government has maintained one of the most shameful cover-ups in American financial history: the systematic denial and erasure of Haym Salomon's indispensable contributions to American independence. Rachel Salomon passed away in 1827, Having spent 42 relentless years tirelessly seeking acknowledgement of her husband's profound financial sacrifice and repayment of her family's losses, she had appealed to 7 different presidents, petitioned Congress an astounding 23 times, and meticulously provided detailed documentation of her husband's loans and guarantees to federal, state, and individual American political leaders. Every single request was denied. Every appeal was rejected. Every piece of compelling evidence was dismissed as either insufficient or irrelevant. The Salomon family's unwavering fight for recognition did not, however, conclude with Rachel's death. Her children and grandchildren courageously continued seeking justice throughout the 19th century, presenting increasingly sophisticated legal arguments and historical evidence that definitively documented Haym Salomon's essential role in American financial independence. In 1850, Salomon's son, Haym Salomon, presented Congress with a comprehensive and meticulously researched analysis of his father's financial contributions. This compelling dossier included records from European banking correspondence, detailed transaction records, and even testimony from surviving Continental Congress members who unequivocally confirmed the essential nature of his father's loans and guarantees. The sheer volume and convincing nature of the documentation were so extensive that several congressional committees actually recommended partial compensation for the family's losses. Yet, every single one of these recommendations was blocked by powerful political leaders who argued that acknowledging Salomon's contributions would set a precedent for other speculative claims against the federal government. The true reason for their continued denial, however, was far more cynical. Acknowledging Salomon's pivotal role would necessitate admitting that American independence had relied heavily on private financing from sources that early American political leaders had systematically betrayed and then callously abandoned. This historical cover-up was neither accidental nor incidental. It was a deliberate and calculated policy designed to shield American political mythology from uncomfortable truths about how independence was truly achieved and financed. The standard narrative of American revolutionary financing typically emphasizes government-to-government loans from France and Spain, highlights congressional fiscal responsibility, and extols the financial wisdom of political leaders like Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris. This prevailing narrative portrays American independence as the triumphant outcome of democratic institutions and diplomatic skill, rather than the intricate web of private financial networks and crucial personal credit relationships. Acknowledging Salomon's role would fundamentally undermine this deeply ingrained mythology by revealing that American government institutions were, at times, financially incompetent, that democratic decision-making was often ineffective for complex financial operations, and that American independence ultimately succeeded more because of private financial innovations than due to government policy wisdom. More problematically, acknowledging Salomon's significant contributions would necessitate confronting the prevalent anti-Semitic attitudes that undeniably influenced American political leaders throughout the early national period. Contemporary documents reveal that many American political leaders viewed Jewish financial involvement in government operations as both politically dangerous and morally questionable. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, privately expressed concerns regarding Jewish financial influence on American policy. Alexander Hamilton voiced apprehension about dependency on foreign financial networks that might compromise American independence. Even George Washington occasionally questioned whether extensive private financing created inappropriate political obligations. While these attitudes were not unusual for 18th century political figures, they undeniably help explain why American leaders were so eager to deny and ultimately forget Salomon's contributions once they were no longer essential for the nation's immediate survival. The systematic historical erasure of Salomon's role reflects broader patterns within American political mythology that tend to emphasize institutional wisdom while minimizing individual contributions that do not neatly fit convenient narratives. However, the profound consequences of this historical cover-up extended far beyond the personal injustice inflicted upon the Salomon family. The outright denial of his contributions established enduring precedents for the American government's treatment of inconvenient financial relationships and international commitments, thereby shaping American financial policy for generations to come. The principle established in the Salomon case that the American government could abandon financial obligations when honoring them became politically or economically difficult, became a recurring and troubling pattern in American international relations. Indigenous nations that had provided crucial military support during American expansion were unceremoniously abandoned when their continued alliance became inconvenient. European creditors who had financed American development were repudiated when repayment became politically unpopular. International agreements that had served American interests were brazenly violated when maintaining them became economically costly. The Salomon precedent effectively taught international partners that American financial and political commitments were reliable only for as long as they remained convenient for American interests. Domestically, the Salomon betrayal firmly established that private financial support for government operations carried an enormous risk of repudiation when political circumstances inevitably changed. This chilling precedent actively discouraged private involvement in government financing and contributed significantly to the development of American financial institutions that deliberately minimized private sector participation in public finance. The long-term consequences were profound and far-reaching. American financial development was thus shaped by institutional approaches that studiously avoided the very private sector relationships that had proven absolutely essential for revolutionary success. International financial relationships were meticulously structured to minimize American government obligations to private creditors. Government financial operations were designed specifically to reduce dependence on individual expertise and personal credit relationships. In essence, the betrayal of Haym Salomon reshaped American financial institutions with the explicit aim of preventing anyone from ever achieving similar influence or facing a similar tragic risk. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Salomon case is the sheer completeness with which his monumental contributions were erased from American historical memory. By 1850, most Americans had never even heard of Haym Salomon. By 1900, his name had virtually vanished from the majority of historical accounts concerning American independence. By 1950, even Jewish American historical organizations possessed only limited knowledge of his crucial role in revolutionary financing. The man who had financed American independence had been systematically deleted from the very story of American independence. This erasure was not accidental. It was the direct result of deliberate decisions made by historians, politicians, and educational institutions who found Salomon's true story inconvenient for the prevailing American national mythology. Acknowledging that American independence had profoundly depended on one individual's private financial network directly undermined narratives that emphasized institutional wisdom and democratic decision-making. Recognizing that the single most important financier of American independence was a Jewish immigrant, complicated stories that proudly portrayed American success as solely the result of an Anglo-Protestant political culture, admitting that the American government had betrayed its most important financial supporter, raised uncomfortable questions about American moral character and institutional reliability. Ultimately, it was simply easier to forget Haym Salomon than to confront the profound implications of his story. The few modern attempts to acknowledge Salomon's contributions have been notably limited and superficial. A postage stamp in 1975, a small monument in Chicago, occasional mentions in highly specialized historical publications. These token gestures serve primarily to demonstrate just how thoroughly his actual, vital role has been forgotten, rather than providing any meaningful recognition of his contributions. In 2008, the Salomon family's descendants made one final, valiant attempt to secure congressional recognition of their ancestors' critical role in American independence. They presented comprehensive documentation, thorough historical analysis, and compelling legal arguments that definitively established Haym Salomon's essential contributions to American financial independence. Congress acknowledged the historical evidence, but, regrettably, declined to provide compensation or formal recognition, arguing that too much time had elapsed for remedial action to be appropriate. The betrayal was so deep that in 1893, Congress even refused a simple $250 gold medal as a family heirloom in exchange for waiving millions in debt and those 13 stars on the back of your $1 bill. Conspiracy theorists love to claim they form a Star of David to honor Salomon, but the cold truth is that the bill wasn't even designed until 1937, making it yet another myth in the complex ghost story of America's founding financier. The real reason for this continued denial remains precisely the same as it was in 1785. Acknowledging Salomon's role would inevitably require confronting uncomfortable truths about American historical mythology, institutional reliability, and the moral character that American political leaders consistently prefer to sidestep. Haym Salomon single-handedly financed American independence and, in doing so, laid the groundwork for American financial institutions. His profound reward was betrayal, historical erasure, and 237 years of systematic denial by the very government he helped bring into being. The United States owes its very existence to a man most Americans have never even heard of, and its government shamefully perpetuates that denial today. The story of Haym Salomon, however, did not conclude with his death in 1785, nor even with his family's decades-long battle for recognition. Instead, his groundbreaking financial innovations became the invisible bedrock of modern American capitalism, and his betrayal chillingly established enduring patterns that continue to dictate how America treats inconvenient allies and financial partners to this day. Walk into a J.P. Morgan Chase, a Bank of America, or virtually any major financial institution, and you are witnessing systems that operate on principles Salomon first pioneered some 245 years ago. Consider the correspondent banking networks that enable instantaneous international transfers. Salomon crafted the first iteration of these in 1778 to channel Continental Congress funds from European creditors to critical American military operations, or multi-currency arbitrage, a technique that generates billions in trading profits. Salomon was masterfully calculating exchange rate differentials between British pounds, Spanish silver, and French gold to fund George Washington's beleaguered army. Even the sophisticated risk management practices that allow banks to lend trillions while rigorously maintaining stability. Salomon developed these techniques when he was guaranteeing more American government debt than any individual in history, all while meticulously maintaining liquid European credit lines for emergency operations. Consider the 2008 financial crisis, when the Federal Reserve swiftly created emergency lending facilities to avert an economic meltdown. The unparalleled speed, immense scale, and intricate international coordination of these operations would have been utterly impossible without a financial infrastructure that traces directly back to the innovations Salomon developed during the Revolutionary War. When the Fed established currency swap lines with European central banks to maintain international liquidity, they were essentially employing highly sophisticated versions of the correspondent banking relationships that Salomon forged with Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Paris banking houses. When emergency credit facilities provided overnight funding to prevent widespread institutional failures, they were applying precisely the risk management principles that Salomon had developed when his personal guarantees were the very backbone keeping the Continental Congress operational. The Federal Reserve's response to the 2008 crisis was, in essence, a high-tech reincarnation of Salomon's revolutionary financial network, private institutions collaborating through international correspondent relationships to maintain liquidity during profound political and economic upheaval. However, there's a far darker parallel that emerges between Salomon's era and contemporary American financial policy: the persistent willingness to abandon inconvenient financial partners when their continued support becomes politically or economically burdensome. The 2008 crisis glaringly revealed that American financial institutions had made extensive commitments to international partners that they were entirely unprepared to honor. Once markets collapsed, European banks that had confidently purchased American mortgage securities, relying heavily on U.S. credit ratings, found themselves summarily abandoned when those securities proved to be worthless. International investors who had placed their trust in American financial oversight agencies discovered, to their dismay, that American regulatory bodies would prioritize domestic political interests above their international financial obligations. The insidious pattern established in the Salomon case to leverage international financial relationships when convenient, only to discard them when they become burdensome, continues to shape American financial policy in ways that profoundly damage long-term international credibility. More recently, American financial sanctions and international banking restrictions have starkly demonstrated how swiftly the United States is willing to weaponize financial relationships that often took decades to meticulously cultivate. International banks that had built extensive correspondent relationships with American institutions found those crucial connections terminated overnight, based on political decisions that brazenly ignored commercial considerations and contractual obligations. The underlying message conveyed to international financial partners remains disturbingly consistent with what it was in 1785. American financial commitments are reliable only so long as they directly serve immediate American political interests. But Salomon's legacy also brings forth something truly inspiring about the immense potential for individual innovation to fundamentally reshape institutional capabilities. Modern financial technology companies that are revolutionizing international payments, currency exchange, and trade financing are, in essence, applying cutting-edge digital solutions to precisely the same complex problems that Salomon ingeniously solved using 18th century communication and transportation systems. Companies like Stripe, TransferWise, and PayPal have built billion-dollar businesses by making international financial transactions faster, cheaper, and inherently more reliable, exactly what Salomon achieved for Continental Congress operations 245 years ago. The entrepreneurial approach that empowered Salomon to create alternative financial networks when established institutions proved inadequate or even hostile is being mirrored by audacious innovators who are now building alternative financial infrastructure when traditional banking systems are too slow, prohibitively expensive, or unduly restrictive. Bitcoin and cryptocurrency networks, in particular, represent the ultimate expression of Salomon's innovative approach to finance, creating alternative currency and payment systems that operate with remarkable independence from government control or institutional oversight. The decentralized financial networks that cryptocurrency advocates vehemently promote as revolutionary solutions to entrenched institutional financial control are, in their fundamental essence, digital versions of the private merchant networks that Salomon so effectively utilized to finance American independence. The irony is profound. Modern financial rebels who are diligently building alternative systems to challenge American financial hegemony are employing techniques pioneered by the very man who created American financial independence. This pervasive institutional dishonesty not only undermines international confidence in American reliability, but also erodes domestic confidence in American moral authority. Yet, there is also a profound sense of hope embedded within Salomon's legacy for individuals who are willing to risk everything to build something better. Every immigrant entrepreneur who courageously develops innovative solutions to entrenched institutional problems is unequivocally following Salomon's extraordinary example. Every financial innovator who fearlessly creates alternative systems when established institutions prove inadequate is directly applying his resourceful approach. Every individual who sacrifices personal security to enable systemic improvement is demonstrating the same unwavering commitment that made American independence possible. Salomon's story powerfully proves that individual capability and moral commitment can indeed overcome institutional limitations and political obstacles that, at first glance, might seem utterly insurmountable. His financial genius undeniably changed world history. Despite operating from a cramped office with no official authority and no institutional backing whatsoever, the lesson here isn't that individuals should expect recognition or compensation for their invaluable contributions. Salomon's bitter betrayal tragically demonstrates how dangerous such an expectation can be. Rather, the vital lesson is that individual innovation possesses the transformative power to reshape institutional capabilities in ways that profoundly outlast the innovators themselves. Haym Salomon's financial techniques continue to enable international commerce, government finance, and private enterprise, a remarkable 245 years after his death. His innovations have proven more durable than the institutions that betrayed him, more influential than the political leaders who denied him, and far more essential than the historical narratives that erased him. The ultimate measure of his success isn't whether American institutions eventually acknowledged his contributions. It's whether his innovations continued to improve human capabilities for international cooperation, economic development, and financial stability. On that profound measure, Haym Salomon achieved immortality. His legacy lives on in every international transaction, every currency exchange, every emergency credit facility, and every financial innovation that makes global commerce feasible. Yet Salomon's story also reveals something incredibly inspiring about the possibility of individual impact on historical development. One person's expertise, creativity, and willingness to take extraordinary risks profoundly changed the course of world history. A Polish Jewish immigrant with no official government position, no inherited wealth, and no institutional authority whatsoever created the financial infrastructure that enabled the very birth of the United States. His deeply personal decisions about currency exchange, international lending, and emergency financing directly determined whether George Washington's army survived, whether the Continental Congress continued functioning, and ultimately, whether American independence succeeded or failed. The United States owes its very existence to the unparalleled financial genius and profound personal sacrifice of Haym Salomon. Whether America ever acknowledges that foundational debt speaks volumes more about our national character than about his undeniable historical importance. Indeed, his remarkable legacy echoes in every intricate international financial transaction, in every swift currency exchange, in every crucial emergency government loan. It lives vividly, too, in every immigrant entrepreneur who, much like Salomon, risks everything to build something better for their adopted homeland. The pressing question, then, is whether we are truly worthy inheritors of such a monumental legacy. Thank you for dedicating your time to exploring real American history instead of convenient American mythology. The unvarnished truth, after all, invariably proves far more intriguing than any officially sanctioned version. Join us again next week for more stories they don't want you to know.